A family-centered society. Footnote. Here and throughout this section of the chapter, the Russian term for family is rod, or rodovoy, which refers not just to the family in a particular moment of time, but rather to the tribe, clan, or family line, which includes all forebears in addition to the present generation, and all future descendants. To all appearances, in order to bring back lost, effective traditions and rites capable of preserving love in families, it would seem necessary to obtain full information about the life of our forebears. To this end, we must delve even deeper into our historical past, right down to the family community-centered society, when a husband and a wife who loved each other created a friendly family community together with their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. In today's world, a husband and wife simply cannot hold on to even their closest relatives, their children. No sooner do their offspring approach adulthood than they try to get out from under their parents' wing. They go off to live in a university residence or rent an apartment, often at considerable expense, but they still go. And we're not just talking about children. Many couples separate even before the children come along or shortly after their appearance. The family community-centered society existed many millennia in Rus before the princes came along. It was characterized by an absence of divorce and stronger family units in comparison with subsequent social structures in our history. Only genuine love is capable of starting a family line. In the past, it was much easier for grown children to leave the family than today. I'm talking about the early period in Rus before the arrival of the princes. If two young people who loved each other were not happy with their relationships with their parents, they could leave home and set up their own dwelling on whatever territory they took fancy to. They could start by nourishing themselves on what they found in the forest. Then they would till the ground and establish a household. But they didn't go away. That means the founders of the family line treated them with understanding and love. We need to study this period and from it draw into our modern way of life grains of logic capable of helping build strong families today. But how? By what means can we assess information about this era and people's lives when Russian history describes only the Christian period? Another factor necessitating an investigation to our people's historical past is the importance of determining whether the ancient rites and culture disappeared all by themselves, having outlived their usefulness, or whether the traditions of many millennia were deliberately destroyed. If they all disappeared on their own, there is no point in digging into the historical past, since the people themselves rejected their ancient culture, not seeing it as useful, which means that it would not be accepted today either. If, on the other hand, the ancient traditions were deliberately destroyed, then we must look into the question of by whom and for what purpose. We must seek them out, find them and present them to society for evaluation. It is possible that ancient rites and traditions conceal within themselves such important secrets of human existence that, without uncovering them, we shall continue to move toward an abyss, die out, and torment ourselves with family strife. We often talk about large-scale wars. Family conflict, however, is often more painful for each of its participants than news about war in Iraq or even events in Israel. Recalling everything I knew about ancient Russian history, I decided that, strange as it might seem at first glance, the only thread leading through the vast labyrinth of historical falsehoods was the conqueror, Genghis Khan. In other words, the 300-year period of the so-called Tataro-Mongol yoke in Rus. Okay, footnote. Genghis Khan. 1162 to 1227. The founder, reformer, and unifier of the state of Mongolia in 1206. After uniting the nomadic tribes of the Northeast and Central Asia, he organized campaigns of conquest throughout Asia and Eastern Europe, thus forming the largest contiguous empire in world history. All right. I'm going to read that again. Recalling everything I knew about ancient Russian history, I decided that, strange as it might seem at first glance, the only thread leading through the vast labyrinth of historical falsehoods was the conqueror, Genghis Khan. In other words, the 300-year-old periods of the so-called Tataro-Mongol yoke in Rus. Why? Because this period began shortly after the Christianization of Rus, when the traditions of our ancestors had not yet been completely annihilated. Not only that, but Genghis Khan was just about the brightest, most interesting, and enlightened personality of his time. It is not only that he and his descendants conquered half the world, but it is fascinating to see how they did it. I can tell you right off that their army played only a secondary role in this process. We know from various historical sources that Genghis Khan sent expeditions to many lands as far away as China and India, which supplied him with wise men. He spent a great deal of time conversing with men of wisdom. He was attempting to determine the purpose of human existence on the earth and to find immortality. In other words, he was gathering the wisdom of various peoples and could well have possessed the information about the social structure of ancient Rus. And it turned out, in fact, that he did. I'm convinced that it was thanks to this information that his family, his sons, and his great-grandchildren were able to hold the so-called elite of many countries in subjugation over the centuries. And I mean exactly that. It wasn't countries or their peoples that he held into subjection, but their elites that were usurping the peoples of these countries. Somebody might wonder what on earth the knowledge of ancient family traditions and love-preserving rites has to do with the successful subjugation of states. You shouldn't be surprised. There is a simple, direct relationship, and such knowledge is more powerful than millions of soldiers' swords, or even the most state-of-the-art weaponry. I shall not bother describing the whole 300-year period of the Tataro-Mongolian hold on Rus. I shall cite just one episode, albeit a very typical and interesting episode, the subjugation of Vladimir Suzdal Principality, on which I have collected information from various sources. Let's try to arrive at some conclusions together. A mysterious maneuver chronicles modern historical sources and church literature all talk about a mysterious and even secretive maneuver on the part of Batu Khan, grandson to Genghis Khan, and on the outskirts of the city of Vladimir in 1238. What is the mystery here? This is how the chronicles tell it. Footnote, Batu Khan, also known as Badi, 1205 to 1255, the son of Yoki and grandson of Genghis, who inherited the leadership of the so-called Golden Horde part of the Mongol Empire that covered much of the present-day Russian territory, along with Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the Caucasus for almost 3 centuries, beginning in the 1240s. This is how the chronicles tell it. Having taken Ryazan, footnote Ryazan, a city on the Oka River southeast of Moscow. Having taken the Ryazan in 1237, and the spring of 1238, Bachu Khan and his cavalry pushed their way into the city of Suzdal. As subsequently reported in a multitude of ecclesiastical sources, he burnt Suzdal, exterminated part of the population, and took the remaining part captive. A lot is said in these sources about the atrocities committed against the people. Secular historians, on the other hand, describe the situation more accurately and impartially. Thus, for example, in the materials available in the Vladimir Suzdal State Museum, the event is described as follows. The Tatars set up their camps at the city of Vladimir, while they themselves went and took Suzdal, and plundered the Holy Mother of God cathedral, and burnt the prince's court, and burnt the monastery of Saint Dmitri, and plundered others, and the old monks and nuns, the priests, the blind, the lame, the deaf, the labor-weary, and all other people were slaughtered, while the young monks and priests, their wives, the deacons with their wives, their daughters, and their sons, all these were led away to the Tatars' camps, and they themselves went to Vladimir. As we can see, Bachu Khan did not take anywhere near the whole population captive. He killed off the old high-ranking monks and took the young ones captive. He didn't burn and plunder the whole city, but only the prince's residence, along with Suzdal's churches and monasteries. Now let us try to solve a super historical mystery. Why, as the document says, did the Tatars set up their camps at the city of Vladimir, while they themselves went and took Suzdal? Any military historian, as indeed any modern army commander, will tell you that this is a maneuver completely that goes against standard military tactics. To establish a camp under the walls of a major fortified city and then leave it and move one's troops to a smaller target, this is tantamount to suicide. The distance between the cities of Vladimir and Suzdal at the time was equivalent to 35 kilometers, with the roads rendered impassable by the spring rains. It was a good day's journey on horseback. The taking of Suzdal required a minimum of several more days, and then a day journeys back. It wouldn't have taken any more than a day for the soldiers defending Vladimir to go out of their fortified city on a foray and rout the defenseless enemy camp. All they had to do was seize the spare horses, the spare quivers of arrows, the supplies, the wall-storming ladders, and the stone-throwing devices, and they would have shorn that the enemy not only of the possibility of launching an attack on them, but of their battle readiness in general. But they never went out. Why not? Perhaps they didn't know that Bachu Khan's troops had left the camp, but they knew. They could have easily seen that from their battlements. Besides, their scouts would have reported it. Possibly Bachu Khan's forces were in such great numbers that more than enough guards had been left behind to repel an attack on the camp. This is the way the historians initially explained it. They said the Golden Horde's troops numbered almost 1 million. Then they changed their minds and reduced their estimate to 130,000. Some say as few as 30,000. Naturally, it is tempting to explain one's defeat by citing the enemy's significantly superior numbers. More objective scholars have begun to say that moving 1 million-strong army at that time was an absolute impossibility. 1 million swordsmen together with equipment would mean 3 million horses. If a herd like that were kept in one place, even in the summertime, they would die of hunger. since all the grass around would be trampled down, and in the wintertime no amount of feed supplies would be enough. So the figure was reduced to either 130,000 or 30,000. A humiliating figure indeed. With a scant 130,000 men, Batu Khan quietly went about conquering Russian principalities and whole countries too. But even this figure is inflated to subjugate the Russian princes of that time using the knowledge left by Genghis Khan to his descendants. There was simply no need for even a 50,000 strong army. All that was required was knowledge of the way of life of the Russian people, Russian families, and the proper strategy based on such knowledge. After setting up camp at the city of Vladimir, Batu Khan did not go with a whole army to Suzdal, but sent a small detachment to take it. This is why the people of Vladimir did not leave their fortified city to rout the camp and destroy the enemy's military facilities. Do you know how many days and nights it took for Batu Khan's small detachment to conquer one of Rus's spiritual capitals of the time, surrounded as it was by more than a half-dozen monastery fortresses, this legendary city of Suzdal? No time at all. He simply arrived, entered the city, and burnt the prince's residence. The prince, meanwhile, had fled together with his armed garrison. It was no effort to cut down every last one of the high-ranked clergy and to take the young monks captive, and the Mongols later caught up with the prince and his garrison at the Sit River and destroyed them too. Footnote: this battle took place on March 4th, 1238. Prince Yuri Vsevolodovich was beaten and beheaded by the detachment commander Burundi, who later presented the prince's head to Batu Khan as a trophy. How could that be? Someone may wonder. Where were the brave Russian people, their indomitable and free-loving spirit? I can tell you right off that there was nothing wrong with the Russian people and their spirit. Logic suggests that the people applauded Batu Khan's small detachment on its return journey from Suzdal. They served kvass and braga to the warriors along the whole route back to their camp at Vladimir. The reason is that the people of the time did not look upon Suzdal as their city. Rather, they viewed its royal inhabitants as traitors and its clergy as foreign aggressors and enslavers. This led to the flare-up of a number of rebellions on part of the people against the unbearable oppression. Documents at the Vladimir Suzdal State Museum put it this way. By the end of the 13th century, Suzdal had 8 monasteries, founded by the princes and representatives of the Christian religion. They played a major role in assimilating new territories and served as fortresses in the event of enemy aggression. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the church owned a third of the best lands in the country and was endeavoring to subjugate the power of the grand princes to itself. From the end of the 15th century on, the state made repeated attempts to limit the land holdings of monasteries and churches, along with attempts at secularization. In other words, complete eradication. The question of land provoked 2 ideological tendencies within the church: Josephism and non-possessors movement. Footnote: Josephism, a movement defending the ownership of land by the Russian Orthodox Church, led by Yosef Valatsky, later recognized as a saint, not to be confused with the 20th century use of the same term, designating a movement opposing the Russian Orthodox Church's kowtowing to a communist authority following the 1917 revolution, in this case named after Metropolitan Yosef of Leningrad. Footnote number 2, non-possessors movement, an opposition movement to Josephism, rejecting church land ownership, led by Neil Sorsky, secular name Nikolai Fyodorovich Maikov, 1433 to 1508, a Greek immigrant. And a Greek immigrant, Maxim Grek, secular name Mikhail Trivolis, 1475 to 1556. The first defended the monastery's property interests. The second emphasized the idea of inner self-perfection and condemned the monastery's acquisitive pursuits. The ideological leader of the Josephites was Father Joseph, abbot of the Volokolamsky monastery, while the non-possessors movement was championed by a monk of the Kirillo-Belozersky monastery, Neil Sorsky. The monasteries and clergy of Suzdal, as major landowners, came down solidly on the side of the Josephites. However, in the 16th century, the authority of the Grand Princes did not manage to carry out its intended secularization of the church's wealthy landholdings, which continued to increase even though on a limited scale. Quite a trick. A third of Russian lands ended up in the hands of the Constantinople-derived clergy and its puppets. Footnote, Constantinople, the seat of the Greek Orthodox Church from which the Russian Orthodox Church was derived. Monasteries were transformed into large-scale slave owners, and it wasn't the monks who tilled the ground and raised the cattle, but the peasant serfs. The princes were already trying to reclaim part of the country they had lost, but that was by no means easy. And just how was this enriching the souls of the peasants, whose primordial family lands had now become monasterial property in one fell swoop? What was offered to people in exchange for their centuries-old traditions and rites, which were now labeled barbarian? The same archival documents show what happened here. Fees and penalties imposed on the peasant serfs of the Pokrovsky nunnery in 1653. From each household, 2 altians, a chicken and a lamb's wool from the first shearing. Footnote, altian, a medieval coin worth 3 kopecks, derived from the Tatar word for gold. A kopek is worth 1/100th of a ruble. On the purchase of a horse, 2 dengas. Footnote, denga, a medieval coin worth half a kopek. The plural of this word, dengi, is the current Russian generic word for money. On the purchase of a horse, 2 dengas. Cow, 1 denga. On the scale of grain, horses, cows, hay, 1 altian for each ruble received. Log houses, 1 denga per internal corner. For settling disputes regarding land fields, 2 altins, 2 dengas. Regarding household lands, 4 altins, 2 dengas. Court fees for travel to the site of a dispute, 1 denga per verst. Footnote, verst, an old Russian measurement of length approximately equivalent to 1 kilometer. For travel in case of acquittal, 2 dengas per verst. From the guilty party, 1 altin for each ruble assessed. From the vindicated party, 7 altins, 2 dengas. For taking an oath, 4 altins, 2 dengas. Wedding fees from the groom, 3 altins, 3 dengas. From the bride for a table, 2 altins, 2 dengas. From a groom outside the district, 2 grivnas. Footnote, grivna, an old Russian coin worth 10 kopecks. Wow. From holiday beer making for weddings or funerals, 1 bucket of beer. Penalties for alcohol distillation For oneself without a permit or for sale, 5 rubles, a beating with a cane, and arrest. For consumption of wine, except on holidays, 8 altins, 2 dengas, and a beating with the cane. And here is a description of the property of the highest ranked church official. List of people and property belonging to Metropolitan Ilarion. 16 elders, 6 overseers in charge of properties, 66 personal bodyguards, 23 servants, 25 singers, 2 sextons, 13 bell ringers, 59 craftsmen and laborers, in total 180 persons. Weaponry numbering 93 pieces, silver dishes weighing 1 pood, 20 pounds. Footnote, pood rhymes with food, an old Russian unit of mass approximately equivalent to 16.4 kilograms. A pood was divided into 40 funts, or pounds. Okay, weaponry numbering 93 pieces, silver dishes weighing 1 pood, 20 pounds, pewter dishes weighing more than 16 poods, 112 horses belonging to the Metropolitan's horse farm, 5 carriages, 8 sleighs, and chariots, 147 books. From the Inventory of the Metropolitan's Household, 1701. A most extraordinary document. It is free of any kind of historical inaccuracies. It simply provides an impartial inventory of the Metropolitan's household property. However, it also begs a great many questions. What kind of properties did the Metropolitan have that required the services of 6 overseers? Why a whole 23 servants for 1 man? And were the 93 pieces of weaponry also intended for the conducting of church rites? Note that none of this was the monastery's property. It was just the Metropolitan's personal effects. The monastery had its own. Just who was at such a large contingent of guards supposed to protect the Metropolitan from? He had more bodyguards than the first American presidents. The large contingent of guards, like the high monastery walls, were designed to protect the Metropolitan from the Russian people, of course. The walls of the Suzdal monasteries had no strategic significance in terms of military police. But why then do almost all historical sources describe the high monastery walls with their embrasures as fortresses designed to protect people from the enemy? Why were not these so-called fortresses capable of holding out for at least a month? Because they weren't at all designed for defense against an external aggressor, let alone a smart one. For the soldiers under Genghis Khan's grandson, in any case, such fortifications were no more than a distraction. If the possessors of each of these mock fortresses had not acceded to the enemy's demand for immediate surrender, the Mongols would have thrown up an embankment a little higher than the walls, and dragged their stone-throwing devices up onto it. There are many possible scenarios here. One of them involved putting a bag into the stone launcher attached to a long rope and launching the bag over the monastery wall. Before it hit the ground, the bag would become undone, showering the people hiding behind the wall with infected meat. After that, all they had to do was shoot the people as they attempted to escape through the main entrance gate. The only thing that the high monastery walls served as a protection against was their own people, the peasant serfs, or rather the monastery slaves, who from time to time rebelled. It was none other than the Constantinople clergy who applied their lofty spirituality to the inculcation of serf law in Rus. Footnote: serf law, a feudal system prevalent in Russia, as in other European countries, binding the peasants to the land, subjugating them to the will of the landowners, church, and political authorities. In Russia, it was introduced by the Law Code in 1497, and not officially abolished until 1861. Even after abolition, most peasants, being granted no land of their own, had no choice for survival except to continue in their service relationship with the landowners. Slavery-like conditions persisted throughout the Soviet period. Peasants could not leave their village without a special permission from the authorities and were compelled to do unpaid labor. One document from the Suzdal Museum archives attests to the following. Church landholdings prevailed in Suzdal in the 17th century, as they had before. Monasteries and the metropolitan's residents were major feudal landlords with enormous financial resources at their command, not to mention the free labor of many thousands of peasants. Thus, the Spacio Yefimiev monastery placed fifth among all Russia's church-based feudal landlords. Footnote: the monastery I just tried to talk about, one of Suzdal's principal monasteries, founded in 1352 by Boris Konstantinovich, Prince of Suzdal and Nizhigorod, as a fortress designed to protect the city from enemies both within and without. Its prosperity depended wholly on land grants and contributions. In the second half of the 17th century, the earlier established fiefdoms did not increase in size as the inordinate expansion of monastery lands was held in check by the state. The peasants were subject to a double exploitation, first by the landowners, the corvée and tribute system, and secondly by the state, taxes payable in both money and kind. Or take this quote from a similar document of the history of the Svято-Pokrovsky nunnery. The full and free life enjoyed by the nuns was made possible by the labors of peasant serfs and the enormous staff of servants. The landholdings of the Pokrovsky nunnery grew thanks to rich donations and grants on the part of Russia's most elite families, including princes and tsars. Tsars. So there we have it. More lands, more serf, and more wealth. But let us return to the 13th century. What then actually happened with the arrival of Batu Khan's detachment at Suzdal? And where do traditions and love enter the picture? The population of Suzdal at that time was fewer than 4,000 inhabitants. It consisted mainly of the prince's armed garrison and servants, craftsmen and clergy, with their host of unpaid servants, hiding from the people behind the monastery walls. All around Suzdal and Vladimir lived tens of thousands of peasant families, who were the only ones capable of worthily resisting an aggressor. But they did not do this. They didn't rise up in arms. They didn't go to the monastery walls to protect their clergy. To put it simply, they hated the clergy. Note that they did not hate God, only their oppressors. These people loved and revered God. It was for this reason that the people did not rise to the defense of the city of Vladimir. Batu Khan waited 6 days before storming Vladimir. He waited until the news spread that it wasn't the people he was taking captive, but their enslavers. He waited and took the well-fortified city in a single day. It was to this end that he made the foray against Suzdal. The foray was of no military importance, but it served to deprive the authorities of support from the populace at large. And then what did the Mongols do? Realizing that they could find no better overseers and tax collectors than the princes in collaboration with the clergy, they began to issue the princes licenses to govern the right to collect taxes from the Russian people, a portion of which was to be handed over to the horde. Many monasteries were exempt from taxation. All of this is confirmed by specific documents. Just so people don't go pointing the finger at me or the scientists or secular historians, let us turn directly to literature from the church itself. There is a fairly decent historical book published by the Svято-Pokrovsky nunnery with the blessing of Evlogier, Archbishop of Vladimir and Suzdal, which states, Saint Fyodor, the first bishop of Suzdal, was from a Greek family. He arrived in Rus in 1987 in the entourage accompanying Saint Michael from Constantinople. Okay, footnotes. Evlogier, consecrated Archbishop of Vladimir and Suzdal in 1990. He is an author of 2 books, This Was God's Miracle and A Humble Service. 987, the year before the official Christianization of Rus by Vladimir I of Kiev, 1988, through his baptism at the hands of Saint Michael of Kiev. See footnote 6 in chapter 4. Saint Michael baptized Grand Prince Vladimir at Korsun and subsequently became the first metropolitan of Kiev. Korsun, on the southern tip of the Crimean Peninsula in what is now Ukraine, and St. Michael was appointed first metropolitan of Kiev by Nicholas II Chrysoburgos, who served as Patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church in Constantinople from 984 to 996. After the baptism of the Kievans in 988, the prince, who had been accorded apostolical status, traveled around the Russian cities together with his sons and St. Michael on a zealous proselytizing campaign. Bishoprics were established in Chernihiv, Belgorod, Pereyaslavl, Novgorod, and Vladimir Volynsk. As can be seen from these reports, as well as from others' sources, foreign ideologists were descending upon Rus en masse, complete with hired bodyguards and the prince's own contingent. They began to travel around the Russian cities, breaking down foundations that had been in place for millennia, planting an ideology profitable to the church and government of the day, and establishing foreigners in charge of cities. Many historical documents testify to how the people resisted, though it appears they were poorly organized and they did not expect treason on the part of their own prince. It was this treason that was largely responsible for the massive foreign invasion that befell Rus. The saddest part was that it was done in the name of God. The saddest part was that, what an incredible sacrilege. What if Prince Vladimir and the bishops from Constantinople actually believed sincerely in Christ's commandments, but subsequent events show that their real masters were the exact opposite of God? They were the servants of this opposite, with the advanced ability to manipulate the people, to subjugate themselves to themselves, their spirit and their will. They suggested to man, "You are God's slave," actually meaning, "You are my slave." And man began to forget that God has not and cannot have slaves. Man is the son of God, his beloved son. All the quotations reproduced in this book are taken from historical documents. I gained access to them not by going to some super secret archives, but by simply paying 15 rubles to get into the State Museum and 30 rubles for the right to take pictures. I photographed the displays set up for general viewing. One of them was entitled Monasteries as Ecclesiastical Feudal Landlords. And that is by no means the only official state source. There are many of them. One that exerts an immeasurably greater influence, for example, especially on the young, is a grade 10 high school textbook published by the Prosveshcheny in 2003 and recommended by the Ministry of Education of the Russian Federation. This is a high-quality publication under the editorship of A.N. Sakharov and V.I. Buganov. there's footnotes, but I'm not going to read them. On page 63, it says, along with this, the church persecuted the old folk pagan culture and came out against the Roman model of Christianity, calling it Latinism and apostasy. This damaged Rus's relationship with countries confessing the Catholic faith and contributed to Rus's isolation from the Western European culture. Church facilities began to introduce slave labor. Some clerics and monasteries engaged in usury and victimized people. There were cases where prominent politicians active in the church took part in political machinations. Thus, there frequently arose a discrepancy between the words of the church and its deeds, and this provoked a feeling of discontent among the people. The textbook also mentions that Prince Vladimir, who baptized Rus in 987, was the son of Sviatoslav by a slave of his mother's named Malusha. Consequently, he was accorded a secondary ranking among the prince's sons. There's a lot of footnotes, and I'm not going to read them. If you want a history lesson, then get this book at the library. I got this book at the library. I just don't have the strength to read it right now. Sorry. It further states, Vladimir spent more than 2 years in foreign parts, and when he was approaching Novgorod, he had with him a strong Varangian contingent. Varangian Scandinavian explorers and traders who used the Dnieper River through Russia and Ukraine as a conduit to the Mediterranean and Black Sea merchants. According to the chronicles, they had significant interaction and intermarriage with the Slavs and took an active part in the political life of ancient Rus. He quickly took control of Novgorod and began preparing for his trek south. Along the way, Vladimir conquered Polotsk, where he killed the reigning Varangian prince Rogvolod and his sons, raping Rogvolad's daughter, Rognetta, and forcibly taking her to be his wife. There's a footnote, but I don't want to read it. The textbook goes on to describe how the Kievan prince Yaropolk, Vladimir's brother, came to negotiate with him. No sooner had he entered the hall than Vladimir's bodyguards ran their swords through him. We also read an account of the baptism and the imposition of a sacramental obligation to pay the church 10% of the tribute collected from the people. It should be remembered that at that time, the church was in subjugation to the Patriarchate of Constantinople. Russia still did not have its own patriarch, which means that 10% of the tribute money collected from the Russian people was at the disposal of Constantinople. Might it not be in historical facts like these that we uncover an answer to the question as to why the people didn't rise to the church's defense when Peter the Great closed a third of all Russia's monasteries and melted down church bells to produce cannon, or when Catherine the Great went about secularizing, in other words, confiscating, monastery landholdings, which meant that formerly wealthy monks were obliged to beg for food and live at the mercy of the Tsar. Or when the Bolsheviks started killing clerics and blowing up churches, why some of the people themselves participated in the plunder of the church property. My remarks on the subject of the church are based on historical facts and documents. I have resolved to call upon sensibly minded members of the church hierarchy and its wise elders, who I am sure are out there, to transform the modern church into a highly spiritual institution, one capable of helping society escape from its economic and spiritual crisis. Love and the state's military preparedness. But what link can there possibly be, readers might wonder, between the conquest of Russia and love? The connection is quite direct. After seizing Russian lands, enslaving the Russian peasants, prohibiting rites capable of leading to love, the Constantinople assault force thereby began to hinder the formation of strong, loving families, and especially family domains. This meant, in effect, the immediate imposition of serf law. Love among slaves, as a rule, is a most unhappy love. In order for the feeling of love ignited in young people to be preserved, one's own space is required. If it is not there, love, as a rule, vanishes. And what space could be possessed by slaves? None at all. Let's think. Why, over the many millennia before the princes came to Rus, why was our territory never conquered? There was the Egyptian army, after all, and the Roman legions. But all these hosts, with their well-trained and well-equipped soldiers, did not succeed in conquering our lands. To answer this question, let us suppose that Genghis Khan's troops had launched an invasion of pre-Christian Rus. At that time, the territory of our present-day country was inhabited almost exclusively by people living in family communities. At the approach of an army, no matter what its size, the members of the community would hide part of their food supplies, take the remainder with them, along with their household livestock, and head off into the forest. Their horses and cows were loaded up with family belongings. An invasion army could move into a territory only so far as the provisions they carried with them allowed, but this was already an army on its last legs. The return journey would be impossible. They couldn't go hunting in the forest, as that had to be done in small groups. Any larger groupings would scare away the game. But once they penetrated the forest, small groups would quickly fall into traps and perish. They ate, for the most part, the meat of their own emaciated horses, whose number kept rapidly decreasing, so that any kind of movement became exceedingly difficult. Our ancestors would set up a whole bunch of clever traps all along the route of their foes' retreat, both in the forests and on the rivers. For example, they would sink a huge tree with prickly branches and stretch a cable tied to the tree across the water and fasten its other end to the shore. Whenever a boat approached the spot, the tree would float to the surface and catch the side of the boat in its branches and then sink again, overturning the boat in the process. In the meantime, the retreating soldiers would be met with a hail of arrows and harpoons launched from the shore. But when the retreating soldiers stepped out onto the bank, after gathering together the rest of their troops that had been spread out along the flotilla, there was nobody to be seen. The people annihilated any enemy that invaded their motherland. After all, they had something worth protecting. This was no abstract motherland, defined only by a beautiful word, with not even a clump of native soil to back it up. They had their own family land, the same land that their ancestors had called home. And now it was where they lived along with their families, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And there was love in their families, And they protected their dear mothers and fathers and children. They protected their love. And that was why they could not be conquered.